The valley had been broken for longer than anyone could remember. The land wouldn't grow. Animals wouldn't go near it. And the people who had lived there had quietly carried something away with them when they left, a heaviness, a grief with no name, an exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Everyone agreed it couldn't be fixed. Healers had tried. Scholars had studied it. The official answer was that the hollow simply was what it was. But none of them had what Saren had, and none of them were willing to go. This is the story of Saren, a healer, a woman who spent her whole life healing others, while quietly believing that some things love, longing, were never meant for her. She was wrong, and to discover that, she had to walk into the most frightening place in the known world. The village of Oren was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and most of your business. It sat at the edge of an ancient forest, called the Silverwood, where the trees grew taller than towers. Saren had lived there her whole life. She was 24 years old, with ink-stained fingers and a satchel that smelled of dried lavender. She was the village healer, a title no one had ever officially given her, and she had never officially accepted it. She had simply grown up watching her grandmother heal people, and then one day she was the one doing it, and life quietly continued from there. She was good at it, genuinely good, in a way that went beyond knowledge and technique. When she pressed her hands against a wound, the healing came faster than it should have. When she sat beside someone in fever, her presence alone calmed the shaking. The villagers noticed. They called it a gift, but Saren called it practice and said nothing more, because she didn't entirely understand it herself, and had learned that some things are better carried quietly than explained badly. She lived alone in a cottage at the top of a small hill, with a crooked chimney and a garden that had long outgrown its fence. It spilled down the slope as if the flowers had their own opinions about where they wanted to be. She woke before dawn every morning, lit her lamp, and sat with her books. Shelves and shelves of them, healing texts, old histories, journals filled with her grandmother's handwriting, and maps of places she had never been. She read because it made her feel like the world was bigger, more generous than a single life could hold. She read because in her real life she spent most of her time giving her hands, her time, her attention, and the books were the one place where she could simply receive. She did not think of herself as lonely. She thought of herself as settled. There is a difference, and she knew it. But sometimes settled is just what lonely becomes when you've lived with it long enough. That was her life. Quiet, useful, contained. Right up until the morning a stranger fell from his horse at the village gate. It was the morning after the autumn solstice, the market square busy, the air sharp with wood smoke, and the sweetness of ripening apples. Saren stood at the herb stall, trading dried chamomile for a jar of honey. When she heard the commotion, she didn't run. She walked quickly, with purpose, because when people run, it creates panic, and panic makes everything worse. She pushed through the small crowd that had already gathered at the eastern gate, and that's when she saw him on the ground beside his horse. Dove, the gate guard, was holding him upright with the expression of a man who had no idea what to do next. The stranger was tall, even collapsed, dark hair, skin too pale, clothing that had once been fine, dark blue wool and good leather, now torn at the shoulder and stiff with dried blood. Saren knelt beside him and went to work. She checked his pulse, his breathing, the color of his lips. She found the wound at his shoulder, pressed carefully around it, and felt the warmth of infection spreading beneath the skin. He had been writing for days. She guessed. and had pushed himself far past the point where a sensible person would have stopped. She looked up at Duff and said, "Help me get him to my cottage." Duff, who had learned over many years that arguing with Sarin was mostly a waste of breath, helped her get him to her cottage, and by the second night his fever finally broke. She sat with him through it, the way she did with all her patients, not doing anything dramatic, just being there, keeping watch, changing the cloth on his forehead, and speaking in a low, steady voice when the fever made him restless. She had long since stopped feeling self-conscious about talking to unconscious patients, because she had seen it too often. People heard more than they appeared to. So she told him, in that same low voice, that he was safe, that the infection was retreating, that he had made it this far, and that the worst was behind him now. She said it the way she said everything, lamely and without decoration, because she believed that people in vulnerable moments deserve honesty more than comfort. He woke on the third morning. She was at her desk when she heard it. That small change in his breathing, that meant he was conscious again. She turned and found him staring at the ceiling with the careful stillness of someone taking stock of his own body. After a moment, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark gray, the kind of gray that is not plain, but layered, a sky deciding whether to storm or clear. He studied her for a moment, and then, in a voice rough from days of disuse, "You are not what I expected." Sarin raised an eyebrow. "You were unconscious," she said. "You had no expectations." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough," he said. And that was how she met Keene. She learned about him slowly, in pieces. He was from the eastern provinces, the old territories beyond the mountain pass. He had been a soldier once, though he spoke of it like something he had left behind. He was traveling alone, on an errand he didn't fully explain. Something in the hills had caught him across the shoulder, with a blade, before he could finish what he had started. He was not a simple patient. He asked too many questions, and read her books without asking, which she should have minded, but didn't. He had opinions, strong ones, about everything from the arrangement of her herb jars to the state of her chimney. She pushed back on every single one, and he responded by pushing back on her. And somewhere in that, she found herself enjoying it. Not the arguing itself, but the feeling of being met, of saying something and having it taken seriously, instead of simply nodded at and forgotten. She hadn't realized, until it was happening, how rarely anyone had ever done that for her. He stayed longer than his wound required, and she knew it. But she said nothing, because she had learned, over years of healing, that people often need things that have no name, and sometimes the most useful thing you can offer is simply the willingness not to ask them to leave too soon. They ate together in the evenings. At her table, they talked. He asked about the Silverwood, the village, the books on her shelves, and she asked about the roads he had traveled and the places he had seen. She asked about the maps he used to draw, for no reason other than the pleasure of it. And their conversations moved the way good ones do, not in straight lines, but in widening circles, each one stretching a little further than the last. One night, when the fire burned low and the wind moved softly through the trees outside, he told her the real reason he was traveling. He told her about a place called the Hollow, a valley beyond the mountain pass, in the old territories where he had grown up. Something had gone wrong there, a long time ago. The land wouldn't grow properly. and animals avoided it. The people who had lived nearby had long since left, but they carried something with them, a kind of grief that never really faded, a heaviness that settled into the bones, a kind of exhaustion no rest could cure. Healers had tried and failed. Scholars had studied it, written pages, and found no answers. The official answer was that the hollow simply was what it was, and would remain that way. But Keene didn't believe that. He had spent 2 years searching, following old records, and forgotten knowledge. He had spoken to people who knew things that most had already forgotten, trying to find a way to heal something everyone else had accepted could not be fixed, not because anyone had asked him to, and not because there was anything to gain, but because he had seen what the hollow did to people, slowly, quietly, and he couldn't make himself stop trying to fix it. Saren listened, without interrupting, and when he finished, the room fell quiet. Then she stood, crossed to her shelves, and pulled down the oldest journal she owned. It had belonged to her grandmother, thick and worn, with pressed flowers between the pages. The handwriting leaned forward, as if always in a hurry. She brought it back to the table and opened it. She turned to a page near the back and laid it open in front of him. He looked down at it, then back at her. "How long have you had this?" "All my life," Saren said. "I never understood what it was describing. Until now." The page held a ritual, a way of healing something deeper than flesh, a healing for the land itself, not just the people who lived on it. Something passed down through her family, written and rewritten, even when no one remembered why. They sat together, reading it by firelight, late into the night. And by morning, Saren told him she was going with him to the hollow. He argued. She had expected that. He argued, and she expected him to. He told her it was dangerous, and she said she understood. He said he had no right to ask this of her, and she told him he hadn't asked. She told him she had made her decision, and that was something entirely different. He said she didn't understand what the hollow was like, and for a moment this might have been where she stepped back. In the past, she might have gone quiet, told herself she was being impractical, reminded herself she was only a village healer, not someone who walked into ancient wounds in the earth. This was the moment she would later recognize as the one that had always stopped her before, the moment that had always won. But this time it did. She met his gaze and held it. "I've read everything you told me, and more besides. I have the ritual, the materials, and I know how to use them. You've spent 2 years searching for exactly what I have. The practical argument isn't yours to make." A silence settled between them. Then Keene said, quietly, "I don't want anything to happen to you." The fire crackled softly, and the trees whispered outside. Saren felt the weight of his words, not as a warning, but something deeper. She understood what he meant, so she met his gaze and answered simply, "Then stay close to me." He held her eyes for a moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. They left 3 days later, after she had prepared everything she would need. She packed her medicines and the ritual materials from her grandmother's journal, along with a small vial taken from a locked box, something that glowed faintly and felt warm in her palm. She left instructions for her patients, with old Marta down the hill. Then she stood for a moment in front of her cottage. She looked at the crooked chimney and the garden spilling over its fence, feeling that quiet sense of standing at the edge of something that would change everything. Then she turned and walked toward him, where Keene waited beside two horses, and together they rode into the silverwood as morning light filtered through the leaves, casting gold across the path ahead of them. The silverwood changed when you entered it. Every one who lived near it knew this, and still it was always a surprise. The light moved strangely, as if it had a will of its own. Sounds carried differently there, as if the forest decided where they should go. The path shifted, subtly, guiding you somewhere just slightly off course. Not dangerously, but not entirely by your choosing either. The wood wasn't dangerous. Not exactly. It was simply more awake than other places, and it expected you to be awake too. Sarin wasn't afraid of it. She had grown up at its edge, and knew its strangeness well. Keene was quieter within the wood, moving with a kind of careful awareness, like someone who understood. He was not the only thing watching. On the second evening, by the fire, beneath the roots of an old oak, he said, without looking at her, "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with healing." She thought about it carefully. Then she said, "When I was 12, I climbed to the top of the old watchtower just to see how the world looked from somewhere higher." She paused, then added, "The village looked the same, but I felt different." He glanced at her. "How different?" "Bigger," she said, "like there was more of me than I had realized." He held her gaze. "I know that feeling." She asked him the same question, and he told her about the maps he used to draw, not for duty, but for the quiet joy of it. Maps filled with places both real and imagined. Whole books of them, drawn for no reason, except that it made him feel alive. But he had stopped when everything became about the hollow. Sarin thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "When this is over, you should start again." He looked at her, and for a moment said nothing. Then he nodded. "I will," and she believed him. They reached the hollow. On the fourth day she had read about it, thought she understood what it would be like. But she wasn't prepared. Not really. The valley opened beneath them, great and unnaturally still, even in the full light of day. The grass was pale, thin, as if it struggled to grow at all. The trees at the edges leaned away from it, and there were no birds, no insects, no sound. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but the kind that comes from something long in pain, a stillness that had settled too deep. Sarin felt it press against her, like a weight in her chest. Beside her, Keene said nothing. He had been here before, and knew there were no words for it. So she drew in a slow breath and let it out again. Then she picked up her satchel and started down into the hollow. The altar stood at its center, a ring of stone, cracked through the middle, old, weathered, and waiting, old and plain and unheroic, the way old wounds usually are. They simply sit there, patient, taking up space, waiting for someone to finally pay attention. She knelt beside it and opened her satchel. Carefully, she laid out the materials: salt, silver water, and the small glowing vial. She traced a circle of salt around the broken stone, then poured the silver water into the cracks, and held the vial between her palms as she steadied her breath. And then she became still. She didn't think about the steps or the words. Instead, she thought of everything that had ever made the world feel worth saving. Her grandmother's hands, steady and sure. A child's fever breaking in the quiet of the night. The sound of rain against the roof of her cottage. Evenings at her table, with Keen across from her, their voices moving back and forth like they had always known how to find each other. She gathered all of it, every warm, true thing she had ever felt, and pressed her palms against the broken stone, and gave it. The stone was cold at first, cold enough to bite into her skin, but slowly it began to change. The cold softened, and something deep within it stirred. The crack in the stone didn't vanish, but it settled, as if finding a new balance. The air shifted, subtly, like something long asleep had begun to wake, and somewhere, at the edge of the valley, a single bird called. But it had happened. It had not happened before. When she pulled her hands away, she felt it, a deep exhaustion, settling into her bones, but not emptiness, something quieter, something complete. Keem was beside her, almost immediately, his hand steady at her back. He had been watching, the entire time. "Seren," he said quietly. "It worked." She looked at him and nodded. "It did." And for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he helped her to her feet, steady and careful, and without thinking she leaned into him, because in that moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His arm came around her, without hesitation, as if he had already decided he wasn't going to let her fall. They stood there for a moment, holding steady together, and when the moment finally passed, they made their way back to the edge of the valley. That night they camped there, and for the first time in days she slept deeply. When she woke, the light had changed. It reached further into the valley now, touching places it hadn't before, and somewhere in the distance more birds had begun to sing. She sat quietly, listening to them, and in that quiet she felt it. Not something loud or overwhelming, but something steady, something right. She sat quietly, listening to them, and in that quiet she felt it. Not something loud or overwhelming, but something steady, something right. The kind of feeling that doesn't need words, because it already knows what it is. She had done something that mattered, not something grand, not something that would be remembered in stories, but because the ground beneath those three birds was a little less like a wound than it had been yesterday. Keen was already awake, sitting a short distance away, watching the valley. For the first time since she had known him, he looked unburdened, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had finally been allowed to set it down. She watched him for a moment, and then she stopped holding back. She had been careful all her life, careful with her feelings, careful with what she allowed herself to want. She had told herself it was wisdom. She understood now. It had also been fear, the fear that wanting something too much was the surest way to lose it. But she had stood at the heart of a wound, and given everything she had, and it had worked. She had not been broken by the giving, but changed by it. She got up and went to sit beside him. He looked at her, without surprise, as if he had been waiting, and for the first time she didn't hold back. She looked out over the valley, at the light slowly working its way in. "When we go back," she said quietly, "I want more evenings like the ones we had, at the table, by the fire. I want that to be something we keep." He was quiet for a moment, not distant, just thinking. Then he said, "So do I." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, his eyes steady, clear in the morning light. No storm in them now, just sky. She smiled, just a little. "And draw your maps," she said. "I want to see them." He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "I will," he said, and she believed him, because she could see it in his face, that this mattered to him, and because this moment, this quiet morning, beside her, was something he wanted to keep. The walk back through the Silverwood felt different. The same trees, the same shifting light, but she moved through it differently now, like someone who had seen something true and was still learning what it meant. She had gone in thinking she was only useful, and come out knowing she was brave. They talked as they walked, easily now, without the weight of before. He spoke of the maps he would draw, places already forming in his mind, and she told him about the book she had always meant to write. "I want to read it when it's finished," he said. She glanced at him. "You can help me with it." He raised an eyebrow. "Help you how?" "With the herb sections," she said, "since you seem to have strong opinions about them." "I do," he said, without hesitation, and she laughed, soft and unguarded. The Silverwood caught her laughter and sent it upward through the leaves, as if the light itself leaned in, approving of it. They stepped out of the trees, into the warm light of late afternoon. The village of Oran stood at the forest's edge, exactly as it always had, hearth smoke rising from the chimneys, the faint, familiar sounds of the market, and somewhere a dog barking, easy and untroubled. Her cottage stood at the top of the hill, crooked chimney, garden spilling over its fence, the same as she had left it. She paused for a moment, taking it in, a kind of love for a life built slowly, with her own hands, even if it was small, even if it was imperfect. Keene stood beside her. He looked at the chimney and said, "I really do think it's structural." She said, "It has stood for 40 years." He gave a small shake of his head. "That is not the reassurance you think it is." She said, "40 years is exactly the reassurance I think it is." And with that, she stepped forward and unlocked the door. He followed her inside, and she realized she was glad of it without reservation, the way you are glad of things once you have stopped being afraid to want them. She lit the lamp. He crossed to the hearth, knelt, and started the fire. She filled the kettle. These small, simple, domestic motions, done together, in the easy quiet of two people who had come to know each other, felt like the most natural arrangement in the world, not dramatic, not extraordinary, simply right, the way things feel when they are in the place they belong. Later, when the fire was steady, and the tea was made, and the lamp cast its warm light across the bookshelves, and the herb jars, he reached for a blank page from the stack on her desk and picked up a pen, and he began to draw. She sat across from him, opened her grandmother's journal, and wrote the first line of the index she had been meaning to write for years. His pen moved. Hers moved. The fire made its small, steady sounds, and the Silverwood stood beyond the hill, keeping its old, patient watch. She looked up once, and found him looking at her, not with anything she had to question or wonder about, just looking, clear, steady, warm, the way you look at something you are truly glad to be near. She looked back down and wrote the next line. The cottage was warm, the night was quiet, and far away in the mountains the valley was beginning, slowly, to remember how to be whole, and Sarin healer, scholar, braver than she had ever believed, wrote and was at peace, and was, finally, fully, the end.